The title of my talk and paper today is Evolutionary Explanations of Our Reliability. The topic is whether there's any difference in the prospects for an evolutionary explanation of our perceptual reliability and an evolutionary explanation of our moral reliability. I think it seems to most people that there's an asymmetry. I think it seems to most people it's easier to explain how we came to be reliable perceivers than it is to explain how we came to be reliable moral believers using evolution. And my main task is to explore whether there is any reason, any philosophical reason available to the armchair philosopher to think that's true. And I'm going to argue, no, there's no reason to think evolution is in a better position to explain our perceptual reliability than our moral reliability. Since that goes quite a bit against our initial intuition, a second task I have is to ask what made it seem, wrongly, like evolution's better able to explain our perceptual reliability. And just to foreshadow a little cryptically here, the answer is going to have to do with the way the truth predicate misleads us. We need to use the truth predicate as a generalizing device, and that misleads us into thinking there's a special connection to reliability or truth itself in the perceptual case. Why should you care about this? Of course, the question is somewhat intrinsically interesting. Can evolution explain our reliability in either case? But it's important beyond that because once we raise the question, are we reliable or not, we have to give an affirmative answer to that question. You cannot continue to hold on to some beliefs of yours while denying or even doubting, being agnostic over whether those beliefs were reliably produced, whether they are by and large true. And since our reliability is what some people have called a striking fact, one that cries out for explanation, one for which there's urgency in the need for an explanation, we would be in some trouble if we thought there is no explanation of our reliability, because then we might doubt that we are reliability, and that would lead to a skeptical problem. A disambiguation of our main question will be important here. The rough way of putting the question we're interested in today is, what explains the reliability of our perceptual or moral belief-forming method? But Josh Schechter has pointed out that there are two questions that are being asked here. One of them, the easier one, is what explains how our method operates so that it's reliable? That's the easier question because in perception it's obvious there's some causal explanation of the reliable operation. And it's also an easy question in the moral case because in any case where you're forming beliefs in necessary truths or in things that follow from necessary truths with other contingent truths whose epistemology is easily understood, you can answer the operational question by saying we were pre-programmed to believe the necessities. It's important to point out that these answers to what Schechter calls the operational challenge both exhibit a circularity in them. How would pre-programming allow us to reliably form our moral beliefs? We're pre-programmed to believe the correct necessities, and that's why we can see that this method of ours is operating reliably. We are pre-programmed to believe that being nice is good and being cruel is bad, and so on. And in the perceptual case, there's circularity. We can't even tell that we're engaging in the world in a causally appropriate way unless we use our senses. And so we have to rely on perception to figure that out. Now, the harder question, the other thing that the disambiguation of our main question leads us to, is what Schechter called the ideological challenge. What explains how it came about that we use a reliable method? What explains the etiology of our reliability? This question seems, in the case of perception, like one that evolution can answer. It's harder to see how evolution could explain the etiology of our moral method. Again, in the perceptual case, it seems like evolution is going to select for creatures that have a perceptual method that lets them spot the hungry crocodiles and discriminate the blue and the red blueberries. But in the perceptual case, evolution is going to produce creatures that have an adaptive moral method. Is that an answer to the ideological challenge for morality? And it's here where it seems to me that most of the moral skeptics, or the people who see a need for some revision to our ordinary moral thinking, are moved. And this includes, of course, people like Sharon Street, Richard Joyce, Alan Gibbert, and Thomas Nagel. And Schechter himself also thinks that the ideological challenge is easier to answer in the perceptual case than in the moral case. And it's important that we have an answer to the ideological challenge. Some other philosophers, Masahiro Yamada, Kiran Setia, have said, if you can't give an explanation of how it came about that you use a reliable method, you cannot see that method as producing justified beliefs or knowledge. There's a common worry that evolution has no hope of explaining the etiology of our moral reliability because evolution has produced horribly immoral creatures. Just look at ourselves. But I don't think that this is a real problem. At least it's a limited problem. It seems to me that no matter how far gone things get for us, we're still morally disposed to do the right thing. Under conditions of scarcity and competition, of course, we act selfishly and cruelly toward each other. But just like scientific reliability requires favorable conditions, so it may be that evolution produces us to have dispositions that require favorable conditions to reach the moral truth. And even when you look at all the most horrific moral behaviors you see in the world, even strange behaviors in other animals where they harm and kill and eat each other, you see comparatively selfish behavior. You still see a disposition to favor health and life, and never do you see dispositions to all-out favor death or bizarre things like counting grains of sand. So perhaps our datum needs to be restricted. How could evolution explain the etiology of moral believers who are reliable enough about the goodness of life, health, some kinds of reciprocity? I won't be able to explain why the utilitarians rather than the Kantians are right, or the Kantians rather than the utilitarians, or I won't be able to explain who's right in such subtle disagreements, but I want to explain why overall we're disposed to get things in favorable conditions roughly right morally. It's a serious skeptical challenge if you think, as the debunkers like Sharon Street and others worry, evolution can't be used to explain why we would be reliable even about stuff as general as life and health are good things. Taking care of your kids is a good thing. Is there a very easy way that evolution can answer morality's etiological challenge? There is a suspiciously easy route if you think that all we need to do is explain scientifically, historically, how it came about that we believe P, Q, and R, where these are moral propositions, and then you ask the ethicists to give the grounds in virtue of which P is a moral truth, Q is a moral truth, and so on. And then you'd think you've explained, oh, we believe P, Q, and R, and P, Q, and R, so we're reliable, we've explained our reliability. But I think that doesn't work, and this has been pointed out by other authors. Explaining conjuncts doesn't amount to explaining their conjunction. And I give an illustrative counterexample, this one from Elliot Sober. If all the students in my intermediate logic class have mastered introductory logic, the explanation isn't going to be that Ali learned intro, Bill learned intro, Carol learned intro, and so on for each of them. We are seeking some kind of general explanation. For example, that the class is restricted to students who've already mastered introductory logic. And of course, that's the kind of filtering explanation that it looks like evolution's able to give. So we could explain the etiology of our moral reliability if we could argue that evolution selects for our reliability. Again, that looks plausible for perception. Now we turn to the question, is it as plausible for morality? And I will argue, yes, and I'll try to explain why it seemed otherwise. So now we begin my main positive argument. And of course, I should acknowledge up front, evolution is complicated, epistemology is hard, belief is mysterious. So how are we going to have any hope of making progress on these questions? I want to argue for the thesis that if evolution can explain the reliability of our perceptual method, then it can also just as well explain the reliability of our moral method, their etiologies. And in order to try to gain some clarity and progress on this question, I'll try to use a very simple thought experiment as a kind of initially oversimplified model of how we might evolve perceptual and moral belief-forming methods, and I'll progressively try to complicate and make more realistic the story, of course never making it fully realistic. This will allow us to examine at various stages where the philosophical problem might arise with our giving an evolutionary explanation of our moral reliability. So I begin with this simple thought experiment, 2 cases. You can read along on the written version here on the handout or the paper. Case 1 we'll name Open Sesame. We imagine an environment where we have some creatures and there's a protective cave that they need to get into to survive. The cave's entrance is blocked, imagine, by a boulder. And the creature can survive, move the boulder and enter the protective cave, if and only if it says Open Sesame at the boulder, in which case it opens and the creature enters. Case 2, I'll name Traffic Stop. It's just a variation of case 1, except you don't just say one thing, Open Sesame, to the boulder to get it to open. The boulder has a light, imagine it's like a traffic light attached to it, and it displays red or green or yellow. And we say the creature will manage to enter the cave and so survive, if and only if the creature utters red if the light's red, yellow if it's yellow, and green if it's green. Those are the 2 cases. And I hope it's clear that in each case, evolution could explain how creatures would evolve what I'll call a signaling method that successfully opens the cave and helps them survive. My intention is that the first story, Open Sesame, will be analogous to morality. The signalers in Open Sesame can be pre-programmed to give the right signal, since there's just one. And you can give that signal anytime without any need to be sensitive to varying conditions in your environment. The second case, Traffic Stop, is supposed to be analogous to perception. There, the creatures need to behave in a way that's causally sensitive to local conditions that can vary over time. How is our story about creatures who either give the signal Open Sesame to survive, or creatures who give either the signals red, green, or yellow appropriately to survive, going to realistically represent the evolution of our moral and perceptual belief-forming methods? A first worry you might have is, how can signaling behavior be treated as a useful model of belief behavior? I don't think that this is a reasonable worry. I think that just as the differences in your signaling behavior can make a difference to what happens to you, it's similar. Differences in what you believe will make a difference to what happens to you. It makes a difference to how you act, how you speak, how others interact with you. Of course, we're trying to explain a pretty simple and significant difference in belief, like the difference between believing that the berries are blue and that they're red, or believing you ought to take care of your kids, or you ought to not take care of your kids, or do something else harm them or go count blades of grass or grains of sand. So obviously such differences in belief make a difference to your behavior, and that means evolution can select for such differences. I'm talking about creatures giving signals as a kind of vivid, simple thought experiment. You might worry signals are like imperatives. Saying open sesame isn't doing anything that's truth-apt. But I think that this is just a irrelevant detail of the story. We're interested in the causal role, the causal significance of these signals to see whether they could evolve or not. And we can assess them for reliability, as we will go on to. So we'll see that as far as evolution goes, it could equally well select for either one. Next, we have to imagine a more important difference between creatures that issue a signal about a traffic light and creatures like us that can form beliefs about perceptible properties. In our thought experiment, there are just 3 traffic light colors, but there are infinitely many, or I'll just say indefinitely many, perceptible properties out there. I say indefinitely many just to mean we can't easily enumerate all the different things we might perceive. So in order to be a really realistic analogy, our thought experiment would have to be modified so that perhaps the traffic signal could show any of indefinitely many different colors, or maybe it could show other perceptible properties or different quantities or magnitudes that the creatures would need to somehow or other differentially respond to in order to survive. So let's imagine that the case is modified this way. In the Open Sesame story, our creatures just need to say open sesame to survive. In Traffic Stop, our creatures need to give any of indefinitely many different signals in order to get access to the cave and to survive. This now makes an important difference to how we're going to think about the evolution of reliable signaling, or even fit signaling, in each case. What we see now is that we can no longer say that in our second case, Traffic Stop, the fit evolved creatures will develop a method of saying red if the light is red, green if it's green, and so on in any finite list. Instead, now we're forced to say something like, in order to survive, creatures must give the appropriate or the correct signal. Here, we're saying appropriate or correct in order to generalize. And this is the same way we use the predicate is true to generalize. This is the feature of the truth predicate that deflationists have emphasized. For example, in order to affirm the infinitely many instances of the law of non-contradiction, I have to say something other than, it's not true that birds fly and they don't fly. It's not true that dogs bark and they don't bark. I have to say something like, every instance of the law of non-contradiction is true. Even in a case that's not infinite, if I don't know what all the propositions I want to affirm are, if I want to agree with everything the Pope says, I need the truth predicate. I have to say everything Pope Francis says is true, for example. So we see that with our creatures in our model of how perception evolves, we need to start talking in a way that is going to suggest some special role for truth. But I'm suggesting that all that's happened here is that we need to start using the truth predicate because we need to generalize. All that's really changed is that we've gone from a finite to an infinite or an indefinitely large case. There's no fundamental difference between what's happening in Open Sesame and Traffic Stop, even if there are infinitely many colors on the traffic light. So I propose that it's this role, this need to use the truth predicate, that is what's so strongly, but wrongly, tempting us to think that evolution gives some special explanation of why we would be reliable perceivers, why we would develop methods for perceiving the truth. And that's my main answer to one of my two questions today. Why does it seem as though there's an asymmetry between evolution's ability to explain our reliability in the perceptual and the moral case? Let me give you some quotations from people who've seen that asymmetry in a way that I think suggests that they are being very strongly drawn to this use that we need to make of the truth predicate or an analogous device of generalization. Josh Schechter says, "We have a reliable visual mechanism because, very roughly, it conferred a heritable survival or reproductive advantage on our ancestors to correctly represent their environment using vision." And as I said, Schechter thinks here we are explaining the etiology of the reliability of our use of a reliable perceptual method, and we cannot so well explain the etiology of our use of a reliable moral method. Richard Joyce says a faculty to detect lines would have the function of tracking the truth. Alan Gibbard says that in perception, we have an account of why beings like us would tend to get these perceivable sorts of things right. And Sharon Street says, since things with causal powers in one's immediate surroundings are the kind of things that can affect one's survival and reproduction, we can see why selective pressures might well have led us to form accurate beliefs about them. In each case, I think that because they do need to use a device of generalization, and they do need to say there's selection for the use of a method that tracks the truth, for example, they're misled into thinking that this has something to do with evolution's connection to truth itself. I say there's no special place for truth in the evolutionary explanation of our perceptual faculties. There's only a need to use the truth predicate, and this is only because of our finitary linguistic limitations. So we need to use a generalizing predicate to explain the kinds of signaling methods that will evolve. In particular, in our case, I called traffic stop originally, though now we have infinitely many possible prompts and responses. What I've argued so far would just be that we need to say something like, the creatures will evolve a method of successful signaling or appropriate signaling in the perceptual case. But what I haven't directly addressed yet is whether they will evolve a method of reliable signaling, whether evolution will create creatures that give a signal that is true, if, as I suggested earlier, signals can be a good model for beliefs. And it seems to me that this is intuitively what would have to happen. Begin with the perceptual case, the traffic stop case. Is it possible that the signal green represents red and the signal red represents the green signal? It seems to me that any plausible metasemantics is going to connect together the signal green with its causal prompt, a green signal, and the red signal with the red light, and so on. So I see no reason to doubt that in the traffic stop case, in the model for perception, evolution won't just lead to successful signaling, but to reliable signaling. What's important to see now is that there's no special further reason to doubt that metasemantics will secure the same result for signaling in a case like Open Sesame. There it seems to me just as plausible and intuitive that metasemantics will see to it that the successful signal is the true signal, the signal that carries a content that is true. Just as when we imagine animals signaling in nature, or when scientists study animals actually signaling in nature, they assign contents to the signals that have them come out as saying something true in the intuitive cases, such as with vervet monkeys. I don't think that I'm assuming here anything substantive in metasemantics. I'm not assuming the teleosemantics of Millikan and Neander, though of course that's an example of a metasemantics that would secure these plausible results. But I think any sensible metasemantics should see to it that successful signaling is reliable signaling, just as plausibly in the one case as the other. the model for perception or the model for morality. Now, of course, in the perceptual case, there's a different causal role that the signals have. They're causally sensitive, and not so in the moral case. But I don't think that this could be what makes the difference to the plausibility in either case of the successful signals being reliable. And if you really thought that this difference in causal sensitivity is what gives rise to the skeptical challenge for morality, I think you see a very different reason for skepticism than anything to do with evolution. It's the fact that moral beliefs aren't caused by some local truth condition that varies over time that is making you worry. Now, moral concepts and moral thoughts, of course, have further special functional roles that are characteristic of them. That's what makes them moral concepts and moral thoughts. They have special roles, perhaps, in deliberation or social coordination. And I haven't really looked into those. Is that significant here? I don't think it is, because I don't see how those distinctive roles for moral signals or moral thoughts poses any special further challenge to the explanation of their reliability. Those are just further features that would be important to making them moral beliefs, and I leave it to other ethicists, moral psychologists, to tell us whatever those might be. On your handout, you'll see a section on the counterfactual robustness of the etiology of our reliability. I'll skip over that to save time. So finally, let me return to the threat of circularity. Have I, in some illicit way, given a circular explanation of the reliability of our moral belief-forming method? Is there a greater viciousness to the circularity in the moral case than the perceptual case? And I say there's not. I'm not sure how even to articulate the challenge that I've argued in a way that's viciously circular, but one way to see the worry is I've modeled our moral beliefs on signals about something like a protective cave. And what one might worry, how can I take signals about a cave or beliefs about a cave to show that our moral beliefs are reliable? Perhaps our moral beliefs can't be assumed to be anything like our creatures that are trying to get into a protective cave. And to reply to this, I want to say there is a deep and general skeptical worry about circularity that could be raised here, but it would apply just as well to the perceptual case. We could raise the worry in the perceptual case this way. What do creatures having a reliable belief or issuing reliable signals about the properties of a traffic light or a cave have to do with our actual perceptual beliefs about the colors of this and that? For all this shows, our actual color beliefs have nothing to do with any real properties in the world, including the properties of a traffic signal. Well, I say that's an absurd thing to worry about. Is it really tendentious to assume there are color properties in the world, and that certain mental states represent them, mental states that have causal roles just like our creatures signaling about the traffic light? The dialectic is the same in the moral case. I assume, I think my dog just walked in and out of the room. I assume there are color properties in the world. I assume there are moral properties in the world. I assume we have mental representations about perceivable things like colors, mental representations that are our moral thoughts about moral matters. And it seems to me that evolution and metasemantics is going to produce signaling and pair up signaling with conditions equally plausibly in either case. You could doubt various steps of this argument. Are there really moral properties in the world? Do we have moral beliefs? Do our moral beliefs function? Do they have causal roles like these open sesame signals? Does evolution select signals and beliefs that represent their success conditions and so are reliable in the way that I've argued? All these worries are parallel between the moral and the perceptual case, so I see them as general skeptical worries. There's no special reason to doubt that reliable moral thinking could evolve. That isn't also a reason to doubt that reliable perceptual thinking could evolve. In fact, in my explanation of our moral reliability, I didn't even make any moral assumptions. I didn't say at this point or that life and health are morally good. All I assumed is that there are moral properties and facts out there in the world. We have moral thoughts, and metasemantics sees to it, just as plausibly as it does in the perceptual case, that these will pair up for us to be reliable. Okay, to conclude, again, of course, the thought experiment is very simplistic. The details of evolution and perception and moral thinking are complicated. But what I aimed to see was whether there is any philosophical reason, any reason available to the philosopher, to doubt that evolution can as well explain our moral reliability as our perceptual reliability. And I've said the answer is no. That raises the question, why did it misleadingly seem as though evolution has a special connection to truth and reliability in the perceptual case? And there my answer is, because we need to use generalizing devices like the truth predicate. But that doesn't show that evolution explains reliability in a different way in the perceptual case.